Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
Sometimes you just can't get a break. No matter how hard you try, no matter how good you are in the minors, there could be someone blocking your call-up. And when you do get called up, there's someone better or more established in your way. Of course, there are times where you can hit minor league pitching without difficulty, but you just can't hit major league pitching. At least, that's the way it used to be. And next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to talk about the careers of three such players, one of whom had a cup of coffee in the majors, but never stuck: Joe Brovia, Joe Bauman, and Bob Crues.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you could join once again as we delve into the wonderful world of sports and talk about the stars of the game, so many of whom are long forgotten. And today, we're going to talk about the careers of three guys who could really hit a baseball. You know, September has been known as a time for young baseball players to be given the opportunity to prove themselves when rosters expand, especially when they're the property of teams that are no longer in contention. Of course, there are other times throughout a season when a player is called up and given an opportunity to show what he can do. But it doesn't always pan out. In fact, there have been dozens, and I mean dozens of ball players who have appeared in just one game and never given another opportunity. There are those who've been stalled by the fact that a superstar is ahead of them, and the major league team that owns their rights has kept them in the minors as an insurance policy just in case of injury. And then there are those who get the call-up and just don't play good enough to stick. Well, today we're going to talk about three such players. Joe Brovia, who was called up to the Cincinnati Reds at the age of 33, and whose best days were already behind him. Brovia appeared in 21 games, and that was it. In the minors, however, Brovia played 14 years, whacked 213 home runs, with his high coming with the Portland Beavers of the PCL in 1950 with 39 to go along with 114 RBIs. Joe Bauman, the first man to whack 70-plus home runs in one season in professional baseball when he connected for 72 with Roswell of the Longhorn League, which was Class C ball in 1954. In fact, for his career, Bauman hit 337 home runs to go along with a .337 batting average, but he never made it to the majors. And Bob Crues, who in consecutive years in Class C ball hit 29, 52, 69, 28, and 32 home runs, but he never made it to the majors. And we're going to talk about all three with Gaylon H, a terrific author who recently released a new book called Left on Base in the Bush Leagues, a wonderful dive back in time and an examination of baseball careers that almost were. Sure, while this might not qualify these three ball players as forgotten heroes in Major League Baseball, they were certainly heroes in the communities in which they played their minor league ball. In fact, Wes Parker, who used to play for the Los Angeles Dodgers, penned the forward in Left on Base in the Bush Leagues. And he was a big fan of the Hollywood Stars and of minor league star Carlos Bernier. And Wes said, players were not analyzed, dissected, and interviewed to nearly the extent they are today. They played, then disappeared, returning to the mysterious life from which they came. When games were sold out, they roped off the outfield and allowed us to sit on the outfield grass behind the ropes, close to our gods. So close we were within 10 feet of them. We could sense them, hear them, feel their energy. It got so that while driving to the games, I prayed for a sellout so I could share the same grass with them from close range. I think that's a really good description of what minor league ball was like back in the day. And the players were heroes in their community, and like I said, we're going to talk about a few of them on today's podcast. Of course, before we get into this episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes, I'd like to remind everyone that they can follow us on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Check out Sports Forgotten Heroes on Instagram. Look for our page on Facebook or follow us on the web at sportsfh.com. In fact, I encourage everyone to visit us there to learn more about Brovia, Crues, and Bauman. Learn more about today's guest, Gaylon White, and to send us your comments about today's show and to suggest topics for upcoming episodes of Sports Forgotten Heroes. Also, we love your ratings, so please, wherever you can, leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Hey, we're also relaunching our Patreon page, and I need a favor from all of you. Please let us know what type of extra content you might want to hear. If you'd like to submit direct questions to our guests, what kind of contests would interest you, and how we can make our Patreon page great. Please let us know by sending an email to me, Warren, at sportsfh.com. That's WARREN at sportsfh.com. Also, beginning with this episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to read from our mailbag and tweets. That's right, your emails, suggestions, and tweets will now go live on Sports Forgotten Heroes, and we'll read them during the close to every episode. And as always, thank you for your support. Okay, today we're going to talk about three guys who could really whack the baseball. Joe Brovia, Joe Bauman, and Bob Crues. All three possessed incredible power, but found themselves stuck toiling in minor league baseball for years. And only one of these guys ever got a shot at the big time. There are others in Gaylon's book whom we briefly touch upon, like Ron Necciai, the only man to ever, now get this, he is the only man to ever strike out 27 batters in a 9-inning game. That's right, every out recorded by the Bristol Twins on May 13th, 1952 against the Welch Miners in a Class D Appalachian League game came as the result of Necciai striking out the batter. It's a great story, and Gaylon will talk about it briefly later on in today's podcast. In the meantime, let's first talk about Joe Brovia, Joe Bauman, and Bob Crues with the author of a terrific new book, Left on Base in the Bush Leagues, Gaylon White. Gaylon, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. Thrilled you could join us.
I'm pleased to be here.
Hey, your book, Left on Base in the Bush Leagues, is quite unique in that not only does it talk about minor league careers, it really focuses on ball players who were, well, quite successful in one way or another. At least they were in the minors. and they never really got a chance to show their stuff in the majors. First, where did this idea come from? And second, how did you determine who to focus on?
I grew up in Los Angeles when it was still a minor league town. My favorite team was the Los Angeles Angels. They played in Wrigley Field in L.A.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a number of players pass through there, including Steve Bilko, who I thought was going to be the next Babe Ruth. He had already played in the big leagues with the St. Louis Cardinals in 1953. He hit 21 home runs, drove in 84 runs, and 2 years later, he's in Los Angeles. And to a 9-year-old kid at that time, he looked like Babe Ruth. And I found out later that Bobby Grich, who went on to star in the majors for the Orioles and the Angels, he too saw Steve Bilko as a kid and thought he also was Babe Ruth. So I wasn't alone.
How did you determine who to focus on? I mean, there's so many great stories in the minor leagues. How did you determine who you would write about?
Again, being in L.A. and L.A. being part of the Coast League, which was an open classification league and called by some the third major league, I saw some pretty good players pass through there. So Left on Base in the Bush Leagues features 4 Coast League players. Carlos Bernier, Joe Taylor, Bob Dillinger, and Joe Brovia are the 4. My original research, though, also included Steve Bilko. It turned out that I did a separate book on Steve Bilko called the Bilko Athletic Club. I also interviewed, as part of the work I did early on, Artie Wilson, who again became a separate book called Singles and Smiles. Artie Wilson was a former Negro League player, last player to hit 402 in baseball. He hit 402 at over 400. He hit 402 at Birmingham in 1948, where one of his teammates was a rookie named Willie Mays. So these players were all on my list when I started doing the interview work in 1974. I, at that time, was going out to the ballpark quite a bit in Kansas City. I had started my career as a sports writer. By the mid-'70s, I was in the corporate world, but still doing some freelancing, and that took me out to Royal Stadium, where I became good friends with a coach named Harry Dunlop, and the manager of the Royals at the time was Jack McKeon. So I shared with him what I was doing, and Harry Dunlop suggested I write about Ron Necciai, the only pitcher in baseball history to strike out 27 in a 9-inning game.
That's crazy. 27 strikeouts in 9 innings. That's just, I don't care what level you're playing on. That's incredible.
It really is. And Jack McKeon had managed Joe Taylor. Joe was at the end of his career in Vancouver, but he had some interesting stories to tell about Joe Taylor. So that's sort of how it got started. For some people who might be interested, I started work on this on a Smith Corona electric typewriter. So that'll give you some idea how far back it goes. But the first interviews, I remember they were on the 4th of July weekend in 1974, and I drove over to Amarillo to see Bob Crues, and the next day I was in Roswell talking with Joe Bauman.
Wow. So this book took quite some time to put together.
It did. I went on in the corporate world. I became a speechwriter for several top executives, and my time that I had to devote to writing was minimal. I still continued the research. I retired in 2012 and decided it's time to finish what you started so many years ago. And one of the reasons I wanted to finish it is that during the course of all this, I remember watching a Anthony Bourdain show on television, and he was interviewing a poet from Montana, and this poet had written a poem, and they had the words, "Death steals everything except our stories." And many of these players by that time had already died. And I thought, well, I better tell these stories while I'm still around. And so that's what I proceeded to do.
Well, it is a terrific book, and I hope everybody out there gets a copy of it, and we're going to give you a little tease about it, beginning with one of the guys whom you did focus on, and that was Joe Brovia. Tell us a little bit about Joe. Who was he, and for whom did he play?
Well, Joe Brovia was a character right out of Ring Lardner. And Ring Lardner, some of your listeners may recall, was a great writer in the early 1900s. He really was the one who made the term bushers and bush leagues most famous. He's well known for the novel You Know Me, Al, and that consists of letters from Jack Keefe, a fictional bush league pitcher, to a friend back home in Indiana called Al Blanchard. All 6 chapters in You Know Me, Al have the word busher in it. But Joe Brovia was right out of Ring Lardner. He was, in fact, dubbed early on as a young Smead Jolly. Now, Smead Jolly was the classic good hit, bad fielder. He is best known, his ability to chase fly balls was kind of compared with someone trying to catch soap bubbles. Smead had trouble, and so did Joe. In his first pro game, he was 18 years old. This was in the Coast League. He broke in with the San Francisco Seals. His first pro game, he had 3 hits off the best pitcher in the league, and he also committed 3 errors. So from then on, Joe Brovia was known as a great hitter and a lousy fielder. And that later on, the tag was with him throughout his career. When he finally did make it to the majors, his manager in the minors, Lefty O'Doul, Lefty had managed him in San Francisco, and he was the manager in Oakland when Joe finally went up in 1955 to the Cincinnati Reds. But Lefty O'Doul told Gabe Paul, the general manager of the Reds, give him a bat, but don't give him a glove. So Joe, of course, wanted to do more than just pinch hit, but that's all he did in the majors. He was up there 37 days. It took him 15 years to get there, but he lasted 37 days, had 18 at-bats, and then he was back in the Coast League. And that pretty much ended his career because it ended his dream.
He played in the minors for 14 seasons. And, of course, like you said, that included the Pacific Coast League, and he spent a few years in the Mexican leagues, too. Overall, if you piece everything together, he hit 213 home runs, had a career high of 39 with the Portland Beavers of the PCL in 1950, and overall for his career, he hit 311. Now, you just said that you can get a label, in not so many words, and that label can stick with you for quite some time. So his first game, he has 3 errors, and he gets that label. Is that what truly prevented him from getting a real shot at the majors?
Yes, it's like Joe said. He said once they put the old tag on you, whoosh, that's it. And that really was, because very early on, Lefty became very concerned about putting him in the outfield. Eventually, Joe became an average outfielder. He got hit in the head more than once by a fly ball, and he got injured crashing into the fences more than once. In fact, in Portland, the sports columnist, one of the sports columnists there, suggested that he wear a miner's helmet in the outfield. So Joe was not a good fielder, and he'd be the first to tell you. But he was a great hitter, and what really made him a character was he hated pitchers. He said there was never a pitcher that he liked, and of course then he was reminded at that time that he was rooming with a pitcher, and he said, well, that's different. But Joe hated pitchers. He called them all sorts of names, and he just was an intense competitor. He said such things like the best way to fly is to go by air. Another time he was suspended for spitting in the face of an umpire, and he explained, I was frothing. Some of the froth must have landed on the umpire. So he said colorful things. He did colorful things, and again, he was one of the great characters of the old Pacific Coast League, but a great ball player, and that's the bottom line. In today's game, with the designated hitter rule, Joe would be a star.
Interesting. I guess he sort of had a couple of yogiisms in him, long before Yogi was giving us those famous Yogi-isms. You just said,
oh yes,
you just said that he really didn't like pitchers, and you open your book or the chapter on Joe Brovia with a discussion about Joe's dislike of pitchers. Did he really not like them? What was it about them that he didn't like?
In the heat of battle, he hated them, and he called them names like syphilitic sons of a. That's one of the kinder terms that he called them. One of the great stories about Joe was he had gone hitless one night in Seattle, sleepless in Seattle, you might say, and he went back to his hotel room where his roommate, Marino Peretti, a pitcher, was to hurl the next day. So Marino was already in bed trying to get some sleep, and Joe comes in, and he's tossing and turning because he didn't get hit that night, and finally he gets up, he turns on the light. Now, again, this is right out of Ring Lardner. Ring Lardner once did a story called My Roomie, where one of the players gets up in the middle of the night and shaves. Well, in this case, Joe got up. He didn't have any clothes on. He often would grab a hanger and stand in front of the mirror and kind of check his batting swing, see what he was doing wrong. So here he is, standing naked in front of the mirror, and he hollers out to Marino, who's trying to sleep, check this out. What am I doing wrong? And so Marino said to him, nothing's wrong. Your nuts are too heavy. Well, so Joe, the next day, Joe went out, got 3 hits, started telling everybody that Marino had corrected his swing.
Oh, man. Well, one thing about Joe, he could certainly hit. He broke in with El Paso in 1940 when he was just 18 years old. He hit .383 with 103 ribbies. His manager was a guy by the name of Speck Williamson, and he told baseball fans in El Paso, at least according to your book, to get a good look at Joe because it wouldn't be long before he was playing in the majors. Well, he was right about one thing. He wouldn't be around for long, at least in El Paso, because in 1941 he played in the PCL with San Francisco. So tell us about his first year with El Paso and then how he ended up with San Francisco.
Well, El Paso, I had a working agreement with San Francisco Seals, and Joe tore up the league. It was a big ballpark, so he didn't get that many home runs, but he got a lot of triples, which was saying something because he was a slow runner. Joe hit nearly 400, and so he was soon playing in the big league, in the Coast League with the Seals. And the Coast League at that time, I mean, just a few years before, the DiMaggios had come out of the Coast League and gone into the majors. That's Joe, Dom, and Vince. Mm-hmm. And Lefty O'Doul had been the manager to all 3 of the DiMaggios. So here Joe shows up at the Seals spring training camp, and for all purposes, he looks like one of the DiMaggios. He's Italian, too. So Lefty, actually Joe reported as a pitcher, and Lefty told him to get the metal plate off the front of his shoe, take it off, and he was going to be an outfielder. So that was how he started with the Seals. Seals Stadium was a very large ballpark, very spacious. Joe's power was to right and left center. He was a left-handed hitter. He was not a pull hitter. And so his numbers, when you look at his years in San Francisco, they don't show very many home runs. That's because some of the longest balls ever hit in San Francisco were to left center and right center. And Joe, as a matter of fact, hit one of them in a spot where Willie Mays looked at it and said, that's a taxi cab ride from home plate. And so he could hit the ball a long ways, but he was not a pull hitter. It was not until he got to Portland that he became a pull hitter and started to hit the home runs. He had an unusual batting stance. He held the bat down around his belt buckle. He held it straight up, almost parallel with his nose. In fact, when he got to the majors, Johnny Mize, a 4-time National League home run champ, said to a sports writer, looks like that big guy Brovia is trying to hide his bat from the pigeons. So Joe had this unusual batting stance, but it was a little bit. He could. It was like cocking the bat, and he could turn on a fastball. In fact, Chuck Stevens, who I interviewed for the book, and he played with the Browns and was around baseball for a long time. He said throwing a fastball to Joe Brovia was like putting a pork chop on the table for a dog, because Joe was as good a fastball hitter, in Chuck Stevens' opinion, as Ted Williams.
Wow.
He was just a great fastball hitter. He hated now, and this was his dislike for pitchers. Any pitcher who threw him junk, then he got Joe's wrath, and obviously a string of obscenities and other nicknames that he came up with for them.
He spent most of his career playing in the PCL, and what I find interesting is this. Especially during his time, and you alluded to this earlier, the PCL was sort of like a third major league. How good was the PCL, and how good was the competition, and how did Joe hold his own against it?
Well, one of the pitchers to come out of the Coast League was Larry Jansen. He pitched for the San Francisco Seals early on, then later on he returned to the league and pitched for Seattle. And he went to the majors and was a star pitcher for the Giants for several years. So there was a lot of good ball players who came out of the Coast League and went on up. When I was, young enough to remember some of the players come through the Coast League, I remember seeing Bill Mazeroski as an 18-year-old playing at Hollywood in the Coast League. Rocky Colavito later on came through the Coast League. Jim Mudcat Grant. So there were some good ball players, really fine ball players who came up through the Coast League long before Brovia. But even during Brovia's time, and Minnie Minoso came out of the Coast League. So there was a lot of talent throughout that period of time, and a lot of these guys, first off, they made more money out there because the major league minimum at that time was anywhere between $5,000 and $7,000. Also, the Coast League was more major league in some ways than the majors. By that I mean they were traveling by plane long before the teams in the majors were doing so. They were still traveling by train in the majors.
Wow.
The long seasons, the players with the mild climates in the Coast League city, it allowed these players to extend their careers. And besides, they just loved playing in the ballparks and being a little closer to the fans and part of the community.
Was Joe actually property of any major league team? How did the minors work back then?
Well, the Seals, they didn't have, at that time, a working relationship with any particular team. Joe DiMaggio went to the Yankees. Vince went to the Red Sox. Larry Jansen went to the Giants. Gene Woodling, who had a fine major league career and played for Lefty Oldua at San Francisco, he went to the Yankees. So the Seals didn't have a working relationship, and when Joe finally went to the majors in 1955, he was playing for the Oakland Oaks. They weren't connected with any particular team. What happened there was the Cincinnati Reds were looking for a pinch hitter. The previous year, in 1954, Dusty Rhodes had been the star of the World Series, and of course, pinch hitting has always been an art, and some of the great pinch hitters have gotten the recognition they deserve. But I think Dusty Rhodes starring in that World Series in '54 sort of refocused attention on the value on pinch hitters. So the Reds thought they were still in contention. They had some pretty good hitters on that team. You might recall they had Ted Kozuski, Wally Post, Gus Bell. They figured they didn't have any place for Joe in the outfield, but they did have room on their roster for his bat.
And when he got there, he wasn't all that thrilled with being relegated to being just a pinch hitter. Why did Bertie Tebbetts take such an interest in him?
Well, I think Bertie liked him. I interviewed Bertie personally. He was at Royal Stadium. He was a scout at the time for the Yankees, I believe. And so Bertie spent quite a bit of time with me talking about Joe, and I think it was heartfelt when Bertie said that he wanted Joe to succeed more than any player he ever managed. And I think Bertie really wanted to stick him in the outfield and put him in the lineup every day. But he was under orders from Gabe Paul to use him exclusively as a pinch hitter, and that's what he did.
And no one else would give him a shot. I mean, was it a fair shot for him?
No. Now, this happens, but some of the pitchers he faced in those 18 at-bats, Warren Spahn, Lou Burdette, Hoyt Wilhelm, Kurt Simmons. Now, I haven't mentioned a Patsy yet, have I?
Baseball was filled with some phenomenal talent during his day.
Well, I left out Robin Roberts, so so you get the idea. Joe and Bertie mentioned it much. Joe didn't get any soft touches, but as Bertie explained, there was no way that he was trying to help. He was looking for various spots where he could use Joe, but the spots that were available to use him, a left-handed pinch hitter, were few and far between. Given that he was only there, I think I said earlier, 37 days. He was in the majors 39 days, so he was there for just barely over a month. And in that time, Bertie had to use him when he could, and that happened to be against some of the best pitchers ever to play the game.
You know, one of the main figures in Joe's career was, as you said, Lefty O'Doul. Actually, I did an episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes about Lefty a while back, and if anyone is interested in Lefty, a guy who hit .349 for his career, you can check it out. It was episode number 36. Talk about Joe's relationship with Lefty and how important it was, and the fact that Lefty was actually none too pleased when the Seals got rid of Joe.
Joe respected Lefty and liked Lefty, and I think the feeling was mutual. But what happened was the Seals were purchased by a gentleman named Paul Fagan. Fagan knew nothing about baseball. He was a multi-millionaire. He owned plantations in Hawaii, and he bought the San Francisco Seals team. He was more interested in creating nice dressing rooms for the players and also kind of hotel-like or five-star-like hotel restrooms in the stadium for women. And so he had some very interesting. He banned peanuts from the ballpark, by the way, and that drew the wrath of fans, and he had to reinstate the sale of peanuts in the ballpark. He ordered Joe. Joe was a guy who wore his pants down around his ankles. San Francisco, the cold weather and the fog oftentimes contributed to runny noses. Well, Joe didn't bother with a handkerchief. He just wiped his nose with his sleeve. Joe chewed tobacco, and he liked to spit. Joe was not, he was your rough ball player. He swore. He did things that Paul Fagan didn't like. And so Paul Fagan really kind of set out to get rid of Joe. What it led to was Joe was traded from the Seals to the Portland Beavers. Joe was asking for a little bit more money than Paul Fagan wanted to pay him as well. So Lefty had to unload Joe. And so as it so happened, the season opener the next year, or the season opener soon after Joe was traded, was against the Portland Beavers in San Francisco. Well, Joe grew up in Santa Cruz, not too far from San Francisco, and he had a huge following that came to the first game, the opening day game there in San Francisco. And Joe got 2 hits that first day. The crowd had signs calling Lefty Marblehead. And Lefty had been very popular in San Francisco up to that point, but when it came down to this showdown with Joe Brovia, he lost it. And so Joe, of course, had great success in Portland. It was all downhill from there on for Lefty in San Francisco. And Lefty went on to manage in San Diego. He led the Padres to a pennant in 1954. And then he got a chance to go back to the Bay Area in 55 and manage Oakland. And one of the players he wanted to reunite with, one of the players he wanted to play for him there in Oakland, was Joe Brovia. So they were together again in Oakland, and it was Lefty who got him his one shot in the majors with the Reds.
Awesome. So he really was a very important part of the Joe Brovia story. Now, what about Joe's attitude? We've touched upon it. His demeanor, it got him into trouble a few times. And, you know, speculation being what it is, I've got to wonder if some of that was a result. Well, if some of it resulted in him not being called up to the majors, is that at all possible that his attitude, his demeanor, prevented him from getting called up anytime sooner than he did?
It's possible, but I doubt it, because even though he called pitchers' names, and even though he had, he exploded every now and then, he was. The players and the fans loved him. He was great entertainment. He had this self-effacing sense of humor. He once kicked the clubhouse door in Portland, and he got stuck. And this was while a game was going on. He had kicked the clubhouse door because he had lined out to somebody. So the Beavers, his teammates, take the field there in Portland, and they look around, and there's Joe's not in left field. And so they stop the game, and they start looking for Joe. Well, they hear him screaming up in near the clubhouse door, and he's stuck. And they have to pull him out and put him back, back into the field. He did things like that had people laughing. He was just he was too much fun for everybody, including the umpires. They enjoyed him. I don't think that kept him out of the majors. I think in the end it was this concern that he was going to cost you more runs than he could produce for you.
But boy, he could produce runs. I mean, this is a guy who hit some pretty prodigious shots, didn't he? I mean, in your book, you say that he was compared to the fictional character Roy Hobbs from The Natural. Talk about that.
Right. Well, the sports writer there was a sports columnist in Portland who likened Joe to Roy Hobbs. And keep in mind, that was just in book form. There was no movie at that time.
Sure.
The book had just come out about Roy Hobbs and what later on became the movie. I might add that another fellow who sort of was reminiscent of Roy Hobbs was Joe Bauman, because Joe Bauman actually hit the lights out in a ballpark in Artesia, New Mexico.
And we're going to talk about Joe in just a moment.
Right, but that's what Roy Hobbs did in the movie in terms of hitting the lights out. Well, Joe Bauman did that in Artesia, and what the columnist in L.H. Gregory was saying in Portland is that Joe had the same potential of being another Roy Hobbs.
Wow. You know, there are so many ball players who probably deserved a shot at the majors, but they never made it. What about Joe? Did he deserve a shot before his 1955 call-up?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, one of his teammates, Mickey Rocco, who was quite a good hitter himself and played in the big leagues. Mickey Rocco was a teammate both in San Francisco and in Portland, and Mickey Rocco helped Joe become a pull hitter. But Mickey Rocco said to some scouts who approached him after Joe had his 39 home run season in Portland, and Mickey strongly suggested that they sign him, that he would help them. So Joe should have been in the majors as early as the early 50s when he was having those great years in Portland. And, of course, he would have been a much younger man at that time, and I think he would have delivered exactly as he did in the Coast League. But you point out, Warren, something that I think is important, and that is there's a fine line between success at one level and failure at another. Mm-hmm. And that fine line isn't all talent. It's often circumstances. It can be injuries. It can be just getting a chance. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book was that some of the things that I had read about some of these players I feature, I thought was rather superficial and didn't really go into depth as to the players, their personalities, what happened in their careers. And what I wanted to do was to kind of do a deep dive into these guys' lives and find out really what happened. I wanted to understand what that line was that kept them from that greatness in the majors, which some of them were capable of. Now, some of them may not have succeeded in the majors if given a chance, but several of them never got that chance.
Sure, and Joe did get that chance. Whether it came too late or not, that's all speculative. But I wonder how much his reputation as a bad fielder from day one really hurt him. How should we remember Joe? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that certainly was the number one thing. Remember, he was an 18-year-old and labeled as the next Smead Jolly. Well, Smead Jolly is quite famous for being a great hitter in the minors. He won 6 minor league titles. He did have in the majors in the 3 seasons he was there. He did hit over 300. But Smead Jolly was such an embarrassment in the field. And the stories about Smead were not unlike the stories that circulated about Joe. I mean, the classic story about Smead Jolly was he played for the White Sox, and when he played in Boston's Fenway Park, he had difficulty with an incline there in left field known as Duffy's Cliff. And it went up about 10 feet, and it was intended to be a warning track for the outfielders before they hit the wall. Well, Smead had a hard time going up that hill. So his manager, Donnie Bush at the time, worked with him to practice to learn how to go up that hill and catch a fly ball. And they worked, and finally, Smead announced, I think I got it. So first game, Smead goes to the outfield. Fly ball is hit. Now, he had been told, go run back up on the hill and wait for the ball to come to him. Well, that's what he did, but the ball didn't come all the way to him. Smead had to go down and try to catch the ball. Well, what happened was Smead fell. He fell down the hill, and, of course, the ball dropped in. He got back to the dugout and said to a teammate, well, they taught me how to go up the hill, but nobody told me how to come down.
Wow. Crazy stuff. Gaylon, how should Joe Brovia be remembered?
A great hitter. A great hitter at any level. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see him prove that at the major league level. A great hitter, a great character, and as likable a guy as you'll ever find. And a guy who loved baseball and loved to hit. Oh, did he love to hit. He lived for hitting. And, just the image of him standing in front of a mirror in the middle of the night with no clothes on, swinging a hanger, trying to work out the bugs in his swing, that right there ought to convince you that this guy was a classic and one to be remembered.
Sure. All right, let's move on. Let's move on to Joe Bauman. And my first question regarding Joe has to be this. How do you hit 72 home runs in one season and not get noticed? Or at least you're not noticed enough to be called up to the majors or at least moved up to Class B ball. How is this possible?
Well, the San Francisco Seals, and this is 1955, that's the year after Joe hit 72 home runs. The San Francisco Seals, which were in the Coast League, by that time it was a AAA league, they did express some interest in Joe. They supposedly offered him a contract. Joe saw it as more as a PR gimmick and wasn't interested. And part of the reason he wasn't interested was he had a very successful gas service business in Roswell. He operated a Texaco service station. He made more money from the service station than he did playing baseball. Joe liked it in Roswell. In fact, he would wind up spending the rest of his life in Roswell, except for about 2 years when he went over to help his father-in-law out in Hobbs, New Mexico at a liquor store. But Joe liked the small-town life. He liked the service station business. He had gotten into, he'd run his first Texaco service station. It was on Route 66 in Elk City, Oklahoma. He played semi-pro ball in Elk City for 3 months. They had a great semi-pro team there. And they brought Joe in, paid him well, set him up with his service station that he ran with one of his teammates, and again, made more money there than he did playing baseball. He reluctantly returned to organized baseball. He had left his last season organized ball prior to this was 1948. He'd played in the Boston Braves chain. He was with Hartford in the Class A Eastern League. That was, except for one at-bat at Minneapolis in Double-A, that was as high as Joe got in pro baseball. He did not like playing in the East. He had 10 home runs for Hartford. His batting average was something like 278. But he just was cold and miserable the whole year. And when they were going to cut his contract by $200 a month, he told the Braves, I can make more money selling shoestrings on the street in Oklahoma City. So that left him high and dry. He went back to Oklahoma. That's when somebody from Elk City had contacted him, a fellow who had played with him when they were in the Navy together. And Joe played 3 years in Elk City, returned to organized baseball in 1952 with Artesia, which is about 40 minutes away from Roswell. He probably would have stayed in Artesia the entire time, but it was too small a town to support a gas station. And Joe had always wanted to get another gas station after the success he had with the one in Elk City. So after 2 years in Artesia, and he hit 50-plus home runs both years in Artesia, leading the minor leagues both years. And earlier on in 1946, he led the minors in home runs. So in 1954, he moves to Roswell. He gets the Texaco service station that he wants, and he hits 72 home runs. That broke the all-time record at that time of 69, held jointly by Bob Crues and Joe Hauser. Joe Hauser did it in 1933 at Minneapolis, and Bob Crues did it in 1948 at Amarillo. I might point out that on the night that Joe, on the day, last day of the season, when Joe hit the 3 home runs to break the record, they had a tradition there in West Texas and eastern New Mexico called picking the fences. When a ball player would hit a home run, the fans would stick money through the fence. It could be $1, $5, $10, $15, $20 bills. Well, in Joe's case there in Artesia, that's where he broke the record that day. 3 home runs, $800 was stuck through the screen. Now, if you put that into today's dollars, that's $8,000 that he collected just from hitting 3 home runs on the last day of the season.
And that was probably more than he made in a month playing ball.
Well, he made what was top dollar for the league, about $500 a month. He, however, admitted to getting some money under the table. He wasn't too specific where that money was coming from, but $500 wasn't the max that he was getting. So you combine that with his Texaco station, Joe figured that he was doing better than he could on some major league roster. In Joe's case, I think you can correctly say that he lacked the desire to go up to the majors. First, he didn't like big cities. Secondly, he thought he could make as much money in the small towns that he lived in. So Joe was quite content to stay where he was, and that kind of, after hitting 72 home runs in 1954, and by the way, he did it in 138 games.
Wow.
And I might also add they were steroid-free home runs. So later on, Joe basically from then on was just another guy there in Roswell. He remained relatively obscure until 1998 when Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa had that great home run battle throughout the season and focused attention again on Joe Bauman and his record of 72. Now, Mark McGwire, of course, he hit only 70. He didn't make it to 72. But in 2001, of course, Barry Bonds broke the all-time record of 72 for pro baseball. And Joe watched it on TV there in Roswell and said, well, he figured somebody would break it, and, he was happy for Barry Bonds. But I don't think it takes anything away from Joe Bauman and what he did. It's an amazing record, and he did it again in 138 games. And even though he did it at the Class C level, that in some respects is even more remarkable because the lights at that level are not all that good. And the pitchers that he was hitting against, they were young and in many cases extremely wild. Joe was walked about 150 times that year. So you get a pretty good idea that Joe earned his 72 home runs.
You talk about he getting some national coverage or remembrance when McGwire was in pursuit of his record. But when Bauman was in pursuit of 70 home runs, he was also getting national coverage of some sort back then. Can you talk about that and whether or not any major league team took notice back then that this guy was pounding the ball like that?
Well, and near the end of the season, beginning about in August, about the last month of the season, the wire services started to pick up on it, and eventually, of course, when he broke the record, there's a great shot that appeared in Life magazine at the end of the season, and it's in the book. It shows Joe picking the screen there in Artesia after he hit the 70th home run. But Joe, no, I think he had already counted. When he was in Elk City, he thought his pro baseball career was over. When he came back and played in Artesia and Roswell, he figured that no big league team would be interested in him. And when he hit the 72 home runs that year again, the only team that higher up that showed much interest in him were the San Francisco Seals. There's no evidence that any major league team reached out to him. And as far as Joe was concerned, that was all right. In fact, he wanted to quit after the 54 season. The Roswell management talked him into playing one more year. He had 45 home runs the next year. That would be 1955. And then his last year in 1956, he had over the winter had fallen in the snow and injured an ankle. And he quit in June of the 56 season. He'd not played in that many games. He had 17 home runs, but that was it. He was quite content to go back to pumping gas.
Yeah, I mean that's really hard for me to grasp. I mean, was baseball just not important to him? Was his time in the Eastern League that horrible, or did he just accept the fact that, hey, you know what? I don't have the game to make it in the majors.
I don't think Joe felt he had anything else to prove. I really believe that he, in his own mind, was quite satisfied with what he had accomplished. I remember when I was in Roswell, Joe took me out to the ballpark where he had played. At that time, it was called Fairgrounds Park. It later was renamed Joe Bauman Stadium. And it is still called Joe Bauman Stadium. And today, there's a semi-pro team that plays there, the Roswell Invaders. And they wear alien green uniforms, by the way. But Joe walked me. We walked out to the right field fence where he hit many of his home runs. And while we were walking out there, I asked him about a home run I'd heard about. And this was a home run hit in the playoffs right at the end of the 54 season. And it was the 73rd home run for Joe in that season, although it didn't count in his record. But it was a monster shot that Tom Brookshire, who grew up in Roswell, pitched for Roswell in 1954, and of course went on to star with the Philadelphia Eagles as a football player and then become a broadcaster.
Yep.
Well, Tom Brookshire liked to tell the story about Joe's home run that he hit over the right field fence, and there was a rodeo going on adjacent to the right field fence. And the ball carried into the middle of the rodeo grounds, plopped right there, and the crowd stood up and cheered and waved their hats. They knew who had hit the ball. It was Joe Bauman.
Wow.
And Tom Brookshire estimated that ball traveled about 550 feet. And I remember asking Joe about that, and we were out by the right field fence when he said that. And he said, I can pee as high up in that wall as anybody. I'm satisfied with that. And I think that's really what it amounted to. Joe knew that he could hit the ball as far as anybody in the game at that time, including Mickey Mantle or anybody else. He knew that, and he knew, and he also had proved that in the places that he'd played. Now, if you want to say, well, Mickey and the others did it on the major league level, and Joe did it on the minor, well, Joe would agree with you. But he would also, I think, point out that doing what he did, nobody else had done it in the minors, and there was a lot of players who had passed through the minors before and after Joe Bauman, and nobody else did what he did. So I think Joe's right to be satisfied with what he accomplished.
Sure. And you talked about it earlier when we were discussing Joe Brovia. He hit the lights out in Artesia just like Roy Hobbs did in the Natural. What kind of ball player was Joe Bauman? Just how awesome was his power? And tell us about hitting the lights out.
Well, Sports Illustrated, when they reported on Joe's 72 home runs in 1954, and by the way, the same year he drove in 224 runs, he scored 188, and he batted 400.
Wow.
They called his numbers something out of Paul Bunyan, and Joe Bauman was Bunyan-esque. He was 6'5", 245 pounds. Just a monster of a man, particularly at that time. He didn't have great speed, but he was quite agile. And I remember one of the people I interviewed was a bat boy who went on to play baseball and then become quite a successful lawyer. And he was just telling me of Joe's athleticism. Joe would take batting practice right-handed to kind of hone his batting eye. And he could hit the ball quite well right-handed. Joe, by the way, was ambidextrous. Growing up, he was actually a right-hander. When somebody pointed out that it was an advantage being a left-hander playing first base, he switched to being a left-hander. So Joe was quite an athlete, and whatever speed he lacked, he made up with agility, because he really could do some things a lot of people couldn't do who were that size. The story about the lights came from another bat boy, a gentleman named Ralph Nix. He's now an oil man in Artesia, New Mexico. And Ralph was a part-time bat boy. His father was a season ticket holder. So one day, the Artesia team asked Ralph to be a bat boy. Well, he was just intrigued by Joe Bauman. This was 1952. Ralph was just a kid, and he looked at Joe, and he just couldn't believe the size of the man. And so he went up to him in the dugout one day, and he said, have you ever hit the lights? And Joe didn't say anything to him, just kind of smiled and went on his way. Well, 2 weeks later, Joe hit a ball that smacked right into the lights there, busted him in the Artesia ballpark, circled the bases, came back to the dugout, walked up to Ralph Nix. His nickname was Skip. And he kind of tousled his hair, and he says, now I have.
Wow, what power. That's awesome. That's awesome. All right, so his best years came when he played for Roswell, where in 4 years he hit 50, 53, 72, and 46 home runs. The fans in Roswell loved him. What was it like playing there?
Well, the interesting thing is that Joe did this in 1954. In 1956, and I write about this in the book, Roswell won the Little League World Series. And they won it because of a 12-year-old named Tommy Jordan. Well, Tommy Jordan's father was Tom Jordan Sr., who today, by the way, is the oldest living Major League ball player. He'll turn 100 on September 5. But Tom Jordan had played in the minors 18 years, a .338 lifetime batting average. He hit 400 in 1955 playing for Artesia. He was the manager of the Roswell team in 1956 when Joe retired. Tom Jordan, his son, Tom Jordan was still playing at the time. His son led the Roswell team to the Little League World Series championship. Nobody expected Roswell to get that far, but Tommy Jordan pitched and hit the team to the World Series title. Well, what happened was that, of course, led to Little League Baseball and Roswell becoming extremely big, and it killed minor league baseball in Roswell. Attendance dropped to as low as 17,000 in 1956, and soon there was no pro baseball in Roswell. And what happened in Roswell also happened elsewhere in the minor leagues. And so when people talk about the demise of minor league baseball in the 50s and saying it was the fault of television, they're correct. It was also partially responsible was air conditioning, because people got comfortable watching television in the air conditioning living room and didn't want to go out to the ballpark. But another contributor, and one people overlooked, was Little League Baseball, because Little League Baseball was just was still in its infancy around that time. And as it got more popular, people were going out and watching their kids or their grandkids play, and they felt that was cheaper and better than going out and watching a professional team play. So that's what happened. Little League Baseball really took over in Roswell, as it did in so many other small towns.
Roswell is quite interesting. You know, when you talk about Roswell, you have to talk about aliens, don't you? And how about the fictional pieces written even by Keith Olbermann from ESPN about aliens and baseball? It's a little fun, isn't it? Well, talk about that.
Yes. Roswell today, of course, is best known for UFOs and for the sighting of what some people thought was aliens or in the area around there several years prior to Joe hitting 72 home runs. I remember talking to, for the book, I interviewed Harry Turtledove. He's a fine writer. He writes alternate history. And Joe, Harry Turtledove was a big baseball fan. We shared a mutual interest in Steve Bilko. Both of us grew up in L.A. and remember Steve Bilko winning the Triple Crown for the Angels there in 1956. And Harry also was fascinated by Joe Bauman hitting 72 home runs in Roswell. And, of course, Harry asked me one day, or said to me one day, he said, what do you think of when you think of Roswell? Two things, Joe Bauman, 72 home runs, and UFOs. So he wrote a story about the two, and he did a wonderful job creating this scenario where these aliens pull into Joe's Texaco service station to get some gas. And, of course, they had only four fingers. They had their eyes were kind of different. And, you know, Harry goes into great detail describing them, and they leave the service station, and the next time Joe sees them is after he hit the 70th home run. And one of the aliens sticks a $100 bill through the screen. And Joe sees the fingers, it sticks it through the screen, and then he looks and recognizes that this was the guy in the car at the Texaco service station. So Harry Turtledove does a great story. You almost believe it happened. It's how good. He tells the story. And then, of course, the X-Files did a story called, I believe it was The Unnatural, and that was the name of the show. And they took the Joe Bauman character and they mixed it a little bit with the character of Josh Gibson. And they came up with this slugger named Josh Exley. And it's amazing if you listen to the dialogue on the show. The Josh Exley didn't like big towns. Well, guess what? Joe Bauman didn't like big towns. And at one point, someone said about Josh Exley's record, he broke the record, by the way, home run record. One kid said to another kid, well, it's not a big league record. Well, all these are things that are right out of the Joe Bauman story.
Sure.
And so when you think of Joe Bauman, I think there's you don't just think of him as the guy who played baseball, but he has become almost this mythical character that has been celebrated in a popular television series, and then also by a very well-known writer in a story that he wrote. And then also add to that the top home run hitter in the minors nowadays receives the Joe Bauman Award. So several years ago, they announced that the top home run hitter, Chris Bryant, has won it one year. I think the original one was Ryan Howard. So now the top home run hitter in the minors receives the Joe Bauman Award, which is only appropriate because he not only holds the minor league record of 72, but 4 times he led the minors in home runs.
What a great way to honor him. You know, the folks in Roswell really love Joe, and in fact, as you said, they named the stadium in Roswell after him, and he's actually buried across the street from the stadium. So why is it important Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead. Finish that.
I was going to say, why is it important that, like I said for Joe Brovia, why is it important we remember and talk about Joe Bauman?
Because he is, in effect, a folk hero. And I think it's important to remember him not only as the great player that he was, but also to kind of celebrate the folk hero that he became. You mentioned that he's buried adjacent to the ballpark, Joe Bauman Stadium. On one side of the highway, it's the highway from Roswell to Artesia, is what is now Joe Bauman Stadium. On the other side is the cemetery where he's buried. Now, there's something unusual about that, and if any of your listeners ever get to Roswell, New Mexico, it's worth going to the cemetery. Because what you'll see there is where Joe Bauman is buried, and usually there'll be some baseballs that people have placed outside his, around his headstone. But Joe is shown swinging a bat. Now, the artist who did his headstone made a right-handed hitter out of him. Now, there's a reason for that, because the guy who had the headstone made was his best friend and another ball player and a pitcher. And he's buried one tombstone over. And he's shown pitching to Joe. And so for the rest of eternity, his buddy, Jim Waldrop, is pitching to Joe Bauman. And what I accused Jim Waldrop of, he died here last November, and the tombstone was already up at the time. I accused Jim of turning Joe around to be a right-hander, so the percentages favored him more. So, but Jim Waldrop was Joe's best friend. He was a tremendous source for me in writing about Joe's later years, and was with Joe when he died. Joe was a hero to Jim Waldrop, this man who was around Joe's age, and another Oklahoman like Joe. I just think it's the whole thing, going to Joe Bauman Stadium, seeing a Roswell Invaders game. They played during the months of June, July, and then going to the cemetery. All those are well worth seeing if you're a baseball buff.
Very cool. Hey, one last note on Bauman. In your book, you write that Joe said he thinks he made a pretty big mistake when he signed with Little Rock coming out of high school. That move to sign with Little Rock, which did not have any major league affiliation, when he could have signed with a club with major league affiliation, might have cost him a shot at a major league career. Did Joe ever talk about that? Was he bitter about it? How did he ultimately feel about that?
Well, he wasn't bitter, but he recognized it as a mistake, a youthful mistake, because he was just a kid at the time. At the time, he signed with Little Rock. And part of the attraction of signing with Little Rock was that Little Rock often would sign young players and then sell them to big league clubs. And it was recommended to Joe that he might go this route. Well, unfortunately, the Little Rock ballpark was like Death Valley. It was not a home run hitter's park. And so when Joe finally got a shot at spring training in Little Rock, it was, it was not a good deal for him. In fact, he did not do well, and he asked to go back to Amarillo, where he had been prior to going to Little Rock. Mm-hmm. So he felt that going to Little Rock, and that sort of aligned him with the Boston Braves organization, because Little Rock had a working agreement with the Boston Braves. And he did not care for the Braves, and in the end, he did not care for Little Rock. Mm-hmm. That's how he wound up spending, the rest of his life in either western Oklahoma or eastern New Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, Gaylon, there have been some great home run combinations in history. Yeah, you had Ruth and Gehrig, the M&M boys. Heck, you even had the Bash brothers, to name a few. Let's add Joe Bauman and our next subject, Bob Crues, to that list. In 1947, Bauman clubbed 38 home runs, and he had 127 ribbies for Amarillo while hitting .350. Bob Crues whacked 52 home runs and hit .380. Unfortunately, as I was doing research, I really couldn't find any official records for RBIs listed for that season for Crues. But I think one could definitely surmise that he had well over 100. How lethal a combination were they, and how did they get along?
They were good friends. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, I started this book by interviewing them on the same weekend. Mm-hmm. So I interviewed Crues first, and I went down to meet Joe and Roswell, and of course I went back through Amarillo. So I took greetings from Bob down to Joe and Roswell, and when I came back to Amarillo, Joe asked me to pass on greetings to Bob. So they were not. They were good friends while they were playing. Afterwards, like most ball players, they kind of lost contact with each other. I might add that one time, Bob and Joe had gas stations on the same road there in Roswell. And it's like one Roswell resident said, he had a guy who had 72 one year and Crues who had 69 another year. He said, that's a lot of taters on the same street.
It sure is.
But they were teammates in 1946 and 1947. In 1946, Joe was just out of the military. He had spent most of the war in the Navy. He joined Amarillo in 1946. He led the league in home runs. In fact, he led all of the minor leagues in home runs with 48. Crues was in the same lineup. Joe batted fourth. Bob, I think, batted fifth that year. The next year, of course, Crues outdid Joe in home runs, and I believe he also outdid him in RBIs. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but he had 2 great years in the lineup, and they were very supportive of each other. The thing is, until Joe departed, Crues was not considered a home run hitter. A lot of his home runs were line drives, and whereas Joe's home runs were towering shots that just took everybody's breath away. In fact, when Joe was one of these hitters, when he came to bat, everything stopped in the ballpark. People, if it was people selling pop or beer or whatever it was, it stopped because everybody wanted to see Joe Bauman hit. Bob Crues was a great hitter, but he was a line drive hitter, and he was not viewed, even by some writers who covered him, as a home run hitter until Joe Bauman in 1948 went to Hartford. So he was Bob Crues was in Amarillo by himself, and that was the year that Bob Crues hit 69 home runs and batted in 254 runs, which is still an all-time record, and it's an unbelievable number when you stop and think that the most RBIs in the majors is Hack Wilson with 195, and if you're looking at recent times, I think it was Manny Ramirez has the most RBIs in recent times, and I think that was in 1999. Manny Ramirez drove in 165 for Cleveland. So that number of 254 in 140 games is quite amazing.
No doubt. Now, when Bauman left, Crues actually flirted with 70 home runs. Like you said, he had 69 with Amarillo. But there are those who say he did hit 70, and an umpire, forgive me if I mispronounce his last name, Frank Sicori, who ultimately called balls and strikes in the majors, ruled that a ball that Crues hit did not clear a fence, and that ultimately cost him 70 home runs. Would you please tell us about that?
Yes, it was about midway in the season when this happened, and it took place in Abilene. And the official score for the game happened to be the official score for the league. The league was the West Texas New Mexico League, and the official scorer was a gentleman named Bill Chick, highly respected. Bill Chick always believed that it was a home run. In fact, mid-season, he wrote a letter to a sports columnist in Amarillo expressing the concern that it might, in the end, cost Bob Crues the record. And he was hoping it would not come down to that. It did. Last day of the season, there was a doubleheader in Amarillo. Bob Crues had 69 home runs. He needed one home run in the doubleheader to hit the magic 70 mark. Nobody had reached, that was like the moon at that time. Nobody had been there. In fact, Wheaties had already approached Bob Crues and his wife about putting Bob on the front of Wheaties boxes if he broke the record. Well, Bob went out that day, and the previous day he had tied the record, and the wind was blowing out. On this particular day in Amarillo, the wind was blowing in. And instead of getting a home run, he had 4 singles. He had no home runs. He ended the season with 69 home runs. His image was never on the front of a Wheaties box.
Interesting. So in a way, Frank Sicori really affected the popularity of Bob Crues. Intentionally, no. Unintentionally, yeah. He saw it differently than basically everybody else in the ballpark.
Well, this is true, and there were fans who, and even one of the opposing players, said that the ball had gone out of the ballpark. Bob Crues, his nickname was one of the great nicknames, Round Trip. He became known as the Babe Ruth of West Texas, and because of the ballpark in Amarillo was considered a bandbox, and of course Amarillo is out in the Panhandle there, and there's a lot of wind, and a lot of people felt that his number of home runs, 69, was attributed more to the wind than maybe Crues himself. But again, the wind giveth, and the wind taketh away.
Sure.
And that's what happened to Bob Crues on the last 2 days of the season. And I think everybody who saw him play that year believed that he was just in a zone. It was an amazing record that he set. He batted 404 that year, and by the way, that was only third best in the league.
Yeah, I read that. That's crazy. And that's something that that you talk about, is that he wasn't just a home run hitter. He was a good contact hitter, too. I mean, he had averages of 380, 404, 365.
Right.
He could make contact.
Well, in the year that he hit 69 home runs, this is an amazing number. 8 of Crues' homers in 48 were grand slams. 8 grand slams. 12 came with 2 runners on base, and 26 with 1 runner aboard.
Wow.
So his home runs alone produced 143 runs.
Wow. That's a wow.
I mean, that's amazing numbers. Now, interesting thing about Bob Crues, he started his career as a pitcher, and he actually won 20 games in the West Texas and Mexico League.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because he first came up as a pitcher and had 3 fingers or thereabouts. Talk about that. Talk about what happened to him and what kind of a ball player he was.
He had lost the finger. I'm a little hazy right now. He lost a finger when he was younger, as a kid, and I believe it was in an accident on the farm. And so he learned to throw with the 3 fingers and became a good pitcher, sort of a Mordecai Brown of the minors at that time. And in fact, the Boston Red Sox promoted him, took him up to the higher minors as a pitcher. But he wound up, he was sitting in the dugout one day. He was still the property of the Red Sox, and a line drive was hit into the dugout and hit his pitching arm. And it injured the arm, and he never was the same again as a pitcher. So during the war years, he was stationed there in Texas, and he played on a baseball team, and he made a hitter out of himself. And so when he came back into the West Texas New Mexico League, he was signed by a former Yankee who was the owner of the club, and early on the manager of the club, Bob Seeds, an outstanding minor league player and a pretty good major league player. So Bob Seeds signed Bob Crues, and he also signed Joe Bauman and had them in the lineup together for 2 years, 1946 and 47.
What was the knock on Crues? What prevented him from advancing to the majors?
Well, here again, the feeling was, it's often mentioned that Joe Bauman maybe had a hole in the strike zone that pitchers could get him on. Left-handers gave Joe some problems. In the case of Bob Crues was a bad ball hitter. And if you threw a ball right down the middle of the plate, it sometimes gave him a problem. He was a free swinger, and he would tell you that he could hit bad pitches easier than he could hit a strike. So it may well be that, again, that Crues had this he was vulnerable to certain pitches and didn't go any higher. He definitely had the drive. I don't think he was a little more driven than Joe Bauman. Bob Crues did not have a gas station to fall back on. He did later on work at gas stations, but when he worked at these gas stations, it was more for survival purposes. Bob Crues never quite got over falling short of the 70 home runs. He felt that while he didn't think it was intentional, he felt he was cheated out of that 70th home run. He felt that it deprived him of opportunities, such as being on the front of the Wheaties box and perhaps an opportunity to move up higher in the minors. And then he was, of course, property of the Little Rock organization, and he didn't trust the owner of the Little Rock team, a guy by the name of Ray Winder. He didn't trust him much, and neither, by the way, did Joe Bauman. So you might say Bob was kind of out to lunch. There was no place for him to turn. You didn't have the choice at that time of going just anywhere and playing. You belonged to certain teams. And in Bob Crues' case, after the 48 season, he had actually signed to play for Elk City. He was going to go semi-pro and play for Elk City when Roswell offered him a position as player manager. So he wound up going and playing for Roswell. Now, Bob Seeds, who owned his contract, figured, hey, this was a good opportunity for him. He wasn't going to hold him back. So Bob Crues went to Roswell, was player manager, did not have much success as a manager. He wound up playing in there in Roswell and then later on in San Angelo, bounced around the West Texas, New Mexico League a few years before he finally flamed out. But Bob never really got over falling short of the 70 mark. When it was pointed out that he had this record that was going to last forever, the RBI record, yes, he was proud of that, but he considered the home run mark to be of greater importance. He liked to say, well, people don't remember how many RBIs you drove in. They do remember how many home runs you hit.
Sure. I got one more for you, and I'm not going to get the pronunciation right. So let's just do it this way. 27 strikeouts in a 9-inning game. Tell us about that.
Well, you could, yeah. All right. Well, the way you pronounce his last name, it's Ron Necciai.
Ron Necciai.
Right. It's Necciai. Now, if you had called him Necktie, then you would have been in the company of Dizzy Dean, who called him Necktie. Dizzy Dean was doing the Game of the Week in 1952, and when he heard about Ron Necciai striking out 27 in a 9-inning game, and of course Dizzy Dean thought that was pretty fair country pitching, and mentioned it on the Game of the Week. Ron Necciai did this in Bristol, Virginia, in the Class D Appalachian League. In 45 2/3 innings at Bristol, he struck out 109 batters. Well, that got the attention of Branch Rickey, the president of the Pirates, and they promoted Ron and his catcher, Harry Dunlop. Harry, by the way, in his first 2 weeks as a catcher in pro ball, caught 3 no-hitters. He caught the 27 strikeout game by Ron Necciai, and while it was a no-hitter, it was not a perfect game. There was an error in the game. There was a pass ball, so contact was made. But because of the pass ball, he faced another batter and struck out 27. But he went on to Burlington, North Carolina, and again had a prolific strikeout mark there. Struck out 172 in 126 innings. This was in Class B Burlington. Harry Dunlop accompanied him there. And then in August of 1952, the Pirates brought him to the majors. And his catcher was Joe Garagiola. And Ron was about 6'5", 180 pounds. And Joe liked to joke, who hung the uniform on the mound? Because Ron was so skinny. He also had ulcers. Joe said, he was so shaky out there, I didn't know whether he was shaking me off or not. But Ron had a 1-6 record with the Pirates. He actually pitched better than their record would indicate, but that was a horrible Pittsburgh Pirate team. They won only 40 games that season. They lost 100. They lost 124, I believe it was. Trying to remember, they won only 40 games on a 154-game season. So I'll let you do the math.
That means they went one. That means they went 40 and 114. Right,
and so the team was nicknamed the Ricky Dinks because they had so many young players, and they were so inexperienced and in many cases bad players. But Ron Branch Rickey, years later, was asked to name an all-time team of players who had played for him at St. Louis, Brooklyn, and Pittsburgh. And what he said was, the greatest all-around pitcher I ever saw never was a major league regular. He had the best fastball. He had all the learning aptitudes. He was great. And then he named Ron Necciai, and nobody knew who he was saying. In the book, there's a picture of Joe Garagiola with Ron Necciai, and he has signed the pitcher, and he writes on the pitcher, "Best pitching prospect I ever saw. He would have been as big a winner as ever picked up a baseball had he not been hurt." Now, that's what he said about Necciai, and on the picture he wrote that he would have been a star in the big leagues if he hadn't hurt his arm. Ron was drafted at the end of the 52 season. He already had ulcers. The ulcers became worse in his 3 months in the Army. He was discharged. He started to throw a little too soon after being discharged and hurt his arm. he never made it back to the majors.
But tell us about that game in which he struck out 27.
Well, in the game, Bill Bell, and I mentioned earlier that Dunlop caught 3 no-hitters in a 14-day period. Well, the other 2 no-hitters were thrown by a pitcher named Bill Bell, and a hard-throwing pitcher who also jumped from Class D all the way to the majors that year. But in that game, during the game, Bill Bell, Ron had reported to the ballpark that day feeling as if he was sick, and he told his manager, George Sator, that he wasn't sure he could pitch. Well, George had another pitcher ready to go, and then finally Ron said, I want to try it. So during the game, Bill Bell was taking some pills out to the mound for Ron to take and kind of calm his stomach. In between innings, he was eating cottage cheese and Melba toast to kind of, again, calm the ulcers. In the game, there was a pass ball on a strikeout in the 9th inning, and that, of course, resulted in a 4-strikeout inning because he got the next guy. There were
so he struck out 28.
Altogether 4. Right. Well, no, it's 27 because, what had happened earlier in the game, the 4 guys had reached base. So one reached on a walk, one got hit by a pitch, and one reached on an error, and the other by a pass ball. So 4 runners reached base, but because of the pass ball situation, that resulted in a 4-strikeout inning and allowed Ron to make it to 27.
Right. Wow. That's just wow. And everyone could read more about Ron and everybody else we've discussed in your book, Left on Base in the Bush Leagues. Of all the players you wrote about, whose story surprised you most?
Wow. Well, one, I mentioned that early on I interviewed many of these players. There are a couple of players featured in the book that I didn't add until later. And one of them was Pat Stacy. And he was a player, manager, and part owner in the team in Big Spring, Texas. And they became known as the Yankees of the lower minors. And that's because Pat Stacy, he had connections with the Washington Senators, who were already bringing to the States Cuban ball players. Well, Pat got in on that, and he brought over a period of time 200 Cubans to the U.S. to play minor league baseball. He managed in Big Spring from 1947 through 1952. He won 2 pennants, finished second 3 times, third on another occasion. One of the Cuban pitchers that he brought in was Camilo Pascual, who went on to become a quite good pitcher in the American League. Another one was Mike Fernandez, who had a very fine career with Boston. I think won something like 60 games in the majors. A shortstop that he brought in was Ozzie Alvarez. So Pat Stacy brought all these Cubans in. In many cases, Pat Stacy was the only non-Cuban on the team. Now, there were other teams that were bringing Cuban players in. There were some teams in Oklahoma, and there were some other teams in the same league that Pat Stacy was in, the Longhorn League, that were bringing in minor league players. But Pat Stacy, while he didn't speak Spanish, he had a personality that was perfect for handling, in some cases, some hot-tempered Cuban players. He knew how to get along with them. He knew, in fact, there was one Cuban player named Al Valdez, and Al was all upset one day about not getting a hit, and he was sitting in the dugout, and Stacy went over to check on him, and Al said through a translator that it was his bat. Something was wrong with his bat. Well, Pat didn't say anything to him except he took his bat. Next time up, he went to the plate and hit a triple. He returned to the dugout, handed the bat to Valdez, and said, "It's not the bat."
That's awesome. Really awesome.
Now, Stacy, by the way, was the manager at Roswell in 1954, when Joe Bauman broke the record. That is often overlooked. And Pat Stacey batted behind Roswell, behind Bauman in the Roswell lineup, and that made a big difference. While they still walked Bauman every chance they got, they had to deal with Pat Stacey batting behind him. So Pat Stacey was an outstanding manager. He was knew how to deal with people quite well. Again, he brought close to 200 Cubans to the U.S. Many of those Cubans stayed in the U.S., learned the language, became very productive citizens. One of them I write about in the book, Tito Arancibia. He is still living today. Tito, in turn, brought 37 family members out of Cuba, escaping Castro. So the story about Pat Stacey is not only a great baseball story, but it's a great humanitarian story, because he brought Cuban players to the States and gave them a chance at freedom and gave them a chance at a much better life. And so I think Pat Stacey would be that surprise you asked me about. Mm-hmm. When I got into this, I didn't know about Pat Stacey. I kept reading about these Cuban players and this Cuban team in Big Spring, Texas. And the more I dug into it, and then interviewing a couple of the Cuban players, the more amazing a story that it is.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Gaylon, I would love to talk to you about everyone you wrote about, but if we did, then no one would buy your book. Where can they go out and get Left on Base in the Bush Leagues?
Well, the easy answer is Amazon.com. The cheaper answer is the Roman and Littlefield website. If they go to my website, GaylonWhiteBaseball.com, and Gaylon is spelled Gaylon, whitebaseball.com, and click on orders, then they'll see an orders page, and that page will have the information they need, readers need, to get a 30% discount. That takes the retail price of $36 down to $25.20, and then for an additional $5 shipping, you can get the book for $30.20. So that's a good deal. If they want to, I'll go ahead and tell you, if they want to reach out to me at GaylonWhite@gmail.com, I will make a book available to them for $30 plus $3 shipping, and I'll sign it. So those are the deals available.
Awesome. Gaylon, thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Your passion for this subject certainly came out during our show today, and I'd really like to thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Well, I'd like to, if I may, just add one thing, Warren.
Sure.
That really touches on all the books that I've written, because they all go back to this period of time that many of us refer to as the golden era of baseball. And I had one player write this to me in a letter, and I have it written, I have it on my wall. It says this: what would life be if it weren't for the remembrances? We have the future, of which we know nothing. We have the present, which is so close and moving so swiftly by that we can't make much of it. But the past is as clear as our memories will allow. It is the memories of the past that convince me how important what I am doing is in the present. And that's why I'm writing these books, and that's why I urge readers to read one of them or read all of them, and they might be surprised of all the memories it brings back, and hopefully fond memories.
Awesome. That very well written, very well said. And Gaylon, I hope you would consider coming back again.
Anytime, Warren.
Terrific. Gaylon, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Joe Brovia's major league career actually consisted of 21 games in which he made 20 plate appearances. He hit .111 and knocked in 4 runs. Not much of a major league career, but in the minors, it was a lot different, where he hit .311 over 14 years of play. As for Joe Bauman, he hit .337 during his 9-year career with 337 home runs and 1,057 RBIs, although those RBI stats might be incomplete. There might be a lot more than that. And for whatever reason, the stats on Bob Crues are disappointingly incomplete. But from what has been compiled, we can see that Crues clubbed 196 home runs, including 69 in that magical year of 1948, when he also hit 404. Oh, and Ron Necciai, he pitched part of 1 year with the Pirates, going 1-6 in 12 games, 9 of which he started. There were, and still are, so many great minor league ball players who, for whatever reason, never got a chance to play in the big show. And even though they didn't, they certainly enjoyed some pretty special years in the small communities in which they played. And like Wes Parker wrote in the foreword to Gaylon's book, they were like gods, majestic, young, and supremely skilled. Okay, time to open up the mailbag. A few episodes ago, we talked about the career of a terrific golfer, Ray Billows, the only man to ever lose in the final match of the U.S. Amateur 3 times. Of course, in order to make it to the finals 3 times, you've got to be good. And Ray was much more than good. This note comes to us on Twitter from Bill Bogle Jr. at Bogle Photo. I hope I got that right. Anyway, here's his tweet. Few know that Ray wore 2 gloves long before Tommy Two Gloves made it a fashion statement. Well, that's a fact Tom Buggy and I never discuss. Thanks for the info, Bill. And this from David Bellin, who sent us a note on sportsfh.com. David suggests we do an episode about Harry Aganis, who played first base for the Red Sox in 1954 and 1955. Harry was a terrific athlete who played in 132 games for the Bo Sox in 54 and was having a really good season in 55, batting .313 through 25 games when he became ill, never recovered, and passed away. David, thanks for the info, and we will certainly consider Harry for a future episode. Please keep sending suggestions to us. Just go to sportsfh.com and click Contact Us. We'd love to hear from you. Or send us a note on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Once again, I'd like to thank today's guest, Gaylon White, author of Left on Base in the Bush Leagues. And as always, thanks to you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.